Hi, and welcome to Season 2 of the Team Deakins Podcast, a collection of informal conversations between Roger and James Deakins and a guest. We never know where the conversation will take us, so listen in and see where it goes. This episode is sponsored by Aperture, a premier manufacturer of LED lighting with the industry's greatest variety of fixtures for your complete lighting needs. Aperture recently announced the new Storm family of lights. With LED white light quality that matches natural daylight and classic tungsten bulbs, plus extreme low-end dimming while maintaining color quality. Discover more about the new Storm lights and the complete Aperture lighting ecosystem at aperture.com. Today we're tackling the topic of post-production. Joining us is cinematographer Ed Lachman, whose credits include Maria, El Conde, and Carol. It's a big topic, so let's see how far we get. Ed, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
This is great. Let's start in the past, what post used to be for us when we were in the days of the lab. I think it's important to say that the way we timed it was to take the negative, the cut negative, and put it on a Hazeltine, and then the timer would manipulate the red, green, and blue lights to get the light that's right. And then that, between 1 and 50, indicated how much light was coming through the printer doors, or whatever we want to call it, for each value. And then when we did a corrected print, they worked from the print because God knows we didn't want to touch that negative anymore. And they made their judgments, a half point here, a half point there. So it was a very different system than it is now.
Yeah, also didn't always used to be one single negative. It would sometimes be A and B roll.
Oh, all the time it was a cut negative. Yeah.
So it was even more complicated.
Yeah.
What was your experience, Ted?
Well, yes, it was a long, arduous process, but in some ways, I preferred it, and for a strange reason. And that was, you would look at the cut work print with the director and the colorist, and then the director would go away, and you had like a night or a day later when you would come back and look at what you suggested to the colorist. And that always gave me time to talk to the colorist without even the director in the room. That delay gave me a lot of possibilities. Then now in the digital world, which is wonderful that you could have immediate feedback, but if you have the director in the room the whole time, you have no time to have that private time with the colorist. And there's the immediate reaction to what you're doing. And so I always welcome the delay of 24 hours to make changes. Yes, I can be much more precise in the DI now than I could in the film, but I welcome that time. So now what I end up doing is many times going in earlier or staying later, so I can have my input, because directors generally have an overall view of what they want, but they don't know the intricacies of what you have to do to get that look.
I think that's very true. I think that cinematographers and timers have that knowledge that really, if you add a little bit of blue, just a tiny bit of blue to it, then suddenly it all falls into place. While someone that's not as experienced in printer lights or what light does, that's not their whole life. They would tend to go overboard maybe to try and correct it and not know, and then get all muddled up. So
I'm just interested, do you think a director's more involved now in a DI timing suite than they were in the film days? Because my experience was always, I would do the first print that I was happy with when it was lab printing, before the director would come in and see it. And the same really occurred most of the time in a DI suite, but that you found that the director would be more involved sometimes.
It depends on the director.
Yeah.
When I work with Pablo, we come in and look, and then most directors don't have the patience to be in the room the whole time.
Right.
But I have worked with primarily one director who very much wants to be involved in that process. It does become a little more complicated because I don't have any time away to do it. Generally, directors don't have the patience. And so you can do what you're saying, but it also is very important. I've worked with one colorist. I don't know if you work primarily with Joe Goller at Harbor, and he's wonderful to mediate questions, because generally what happened in film for me was they would give notes, I would give notes, and maybe my notes weren't exactly their notes. But when I got my notes in and then they come back and look at it the next day, they go, yeah, see, that's what I wanted. That's great. And I never said that it wasn't exactly what you said at that time. Because I'm sure you've dealt with this. They see one aspect of the image, let's say a white shirt, and that shirt is a little magenta or warm, and they fixate on that and not see the overall image, that if you correct the overall image, yes, it's going to change the shirt, but I don't want to change the whole image for that shirt. Now, it's true digitally, you can go in and change that part of the image. But I just find they obviously don't have as much experience or time in that process, so they don't understand the language, because I still talk in the same language I talk about in film, and like you brought up, talking about points or towards exposure or towards color. We understand that, and this is another interesting aspect that I wanted to bring up, and that's what's happened in the film world and why there's so many complications now in the film world against the digital world that make it complicated, more complicated, is you don't get printer lights anymore. I mean, new LED, even the lab in New York, that's a Kodak lab, it infuriates me that they don't give you printer lights because they don't have an analyzer anymore, because they don't want to spend the time. Even if you said, I'll pay for the time, they don't have the equipment. An older lab like Photochem, still you can get printer lights. How do you know where your exposure is? Sure, you have your light meter or whatever, but you have no reference.
Right.
It just is crazy. I mean, I just did this film, Maria, in Budapest. They had an analyzer. It was totally green. It was like way off, but I could at least understand what the printer lights were, and I just did it for tests. But now, that's one more factor that's thrown to the wind, and they think you don't need it because you can fix it digitally.
Right.
We should say that printer lights are the values for the red, green, or blue, and it's 1 to 50. And that gives you an idea of where your exposure is, what's
so
needed.
you would kind of choose where you would want your printer lights. For instance, my light was usually a little high, so I would print around 27 or 30. But then on some films, I would print in the 40s because I wanted a specific look. And so, you just kind of judge where that number goes. But if you don't have that, as you say, how do you, especially if you're overexposing deliberately by a couple of stops, how do you know that you've not gone too far if you don't have a lab report, if you were shooting film? But then I think still, if you're shooting digital, it's very hard to understand actually where your exposure is on the file, you know what I mean?
Right, exactly. That's why I came up with the EL zone system.
Right.
Because I was interpreting. When I went to the digital world, I was at a loss. Like, I'm not going to depend on a DIT to tell me what I should know.
Right.
So I applied the analog idea of what exposure was based on 18% gray. I mean, it was Ansel Adams. It wasn't like I
Right.
was so brilliant. I just figured, can you figure out what 18% gray is on a sensor? And obviously it's different between Arri or Sony or Red. They determine whether 18% gray is. But once you figured that out, I found out you could base it on stops. So that's basically all it is it's a mapping system to show you exactly what your exposure is based on 18% gray. And that was a godsend for me to understand, which helped me in a film like El Conde, because I could now hold detail in the sky or in the shadow detail, which I would do with a light meter in film, because we had a consistency in the film negative to know if I'm shooting 5219 or 07 or 03. We knew what that exposure range was. And I think that was, like you say, it's generally with 6 or 8 points to a stop. And knowing if you were high, like Connie Hall used to tell me, he would go into the trims. He would shoot it like up to 50. That builds more contrast in the negative. When you were lower, let's say like Harris Savides loved to underexpose, he would be in 18, 19, and that would flatten the image out. Now, what all this is interesting to me is I think now you can expose the negative differently when you know you're going into a DIT. Like Phaedra Piper-Michael, who did the Dylan film, Complete Unknown, was shooting 12,800 in the streets with his Sony Venice 2,
Right.
because that was the look he was getting. And so basically, he was underexposing his sensor 2 stops, because if he based it on the 3200 part of the camera, and they could pull that back and get an image. So that is interesting that now you can start to think of the digital negative like the film negative. That's kind of where I am with, the film and the digital world. It was very frustrating, the last film, because even though I could get the printer lights, they had to truck the film from London to Budapest because they don't trust the X-ray machines.
Yeah.
It was just ongoing. Then here's another aspect. Directors now that are so used to having a DIT on the set and that you can show them the look, they can agree with you that's what the look is for that day. And so they're used to seeing almost timed dailies. But that isn't the world of film. Even though you call up at night, you tell the contact your lab liaison, look, I want it cool inside, but the overexposed. You can give them all the information you want, but still it's some guy that sits down and gives the transfer. Even if you don't go into a print, you just go from the negative to the digital files. It's not going to be the same as if you sit with a DIT and tell them exactly this or that, or we did it that way, try it a little more this way. And so directors then get frustrated and go, well, what's the problem? The dailies don't look right. And half the time they're looking at it on their phone. Oh, I'm glad I'm getting too old to want to work anymore.
I tell you, it's funny. Well, yeah.
It's also true that the systems that they're watching dailies on now, they have to compress the files in order to have all of it to be online. And that definitely makes it look completely different than what it looked like on set.
Oh, yeah. But also, I mean, you can get led astray even watching a monitor on a set. I heard of one film where the director kept saying to the DP they wanted it darker and darker. And this is a very, very experienced director. I'm not going to say his name.
Right.
It kept saying darker and darker. But when they actually, that was on a monitor on set, but when they actually saw it on the screen, it was so underexposed. There was so much noise, they had to reshoot it all.
I have somebody that loves to see it darker, and I know that, so I have all the monitors turned way down.
Yeah. That's a good one.
You know,
Yeah.
and when it's so dark, I say, "Is that all right?" And he goes, "Yeah, maybe it could be a little darker," because everybody's eye, I realize, sees light or luminosity differently, and they also see color differently.
Yeah.
That's what is great to be in a room or on a monitor that and so you can communicate. But everybody has that variation in how they see.
Right. And especially so if you've got an on-set monitor and you've got a bright set and then the monitor's in a tent.
Right.
And you go from the brightness to the darkness or the other way around, you go dark to a brighter monitor. It can lead you astray so easily.
And
it's the same when you're timing, isn't it, in the DI suite? And what I really liked when I was working with Joel and Ethan, it was kind of nice because they wouldn't come in till I would say, I've got something to show. But when we were doing Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, we were so stretching it, they thought they'd better come in and see what was going on. And it was as well they did because, it's that thing, you're looking at an image and you go more and more. We were going more and more red-orange, more and more red-orange. And they came in and said, are you really sure this is what you want? And we didn't realize how much we'd got,
Right.
Yeah, we'd gone completely overboard. We had become so accustomed to the monitor being warm. Yeah.
But also, I think when you're timing too, you kind of have to factor in that time to rest your eye, like to say, okay, let's stop working on this reel and look at it with fresh eyes in the morning.
Yeah.
Because then you see things that you thought, wow, I must have been tired last night.
That was a great thing, like I was saying about film printing, about lab timing. You had a day or two between prints, so you came in quite fresh to it, and maybe, I don't know about you maybe you'd only get 2 or 3 answer prints. So there wasn't this great fuss over, you know what I mean? It was like quite sort of basic. I wanted to ask you, you started off like in the mid-70s, didn't you? The film I remember you shot was Lords of the Flatbush, right? Was that the first film you did?
I had done smaller films, but that was like the first independent film that became got the IA seal and and that was 16 millimeter.
Right.
Reversal 72-52 at night. That was like ASA 25. Oh my God.
Wow.
I couldn't because we were so worried about the grain structure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was like interesting. Actually, I just reauthorized that. I was really surprised at, what I could do with that negative.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. Because I always remember that film. So it was your first major film in a way, and it was also Sylvester Stallone's first film, which is interesting.
Oh, my God, yeah.
So you shot that film on reversal because you were worried about the grain structure on 16.
Yeah, because negative. Yeah, because then negative was very grainy and they couldn't get the speed out of it.
Did you used to do a lot of manipulation of film, of the negative?
Always, I like what you did about printer lights. I would think about printer lights, how that would affect the grain structure. And I was always of the idea of, which I did and still do, overexpose and then, have higher printer lights to affect the grain structure. What I've always done, and even in the digital world, is play with color temperature and gels, to create contrast and to create depth, because when you use a warm color against a cool color, it's very similar to what light and shadows are. So I've always played with that to manipulate the image in color.
But in terms of processing, did you do much cross processing? And
Honestly, I've always pushed. I mean, and more and more, I've pushed because film today looks digital to me. It's so grainless that if I don't push it a stop, I lose the feeling that it's grain. Generally, I see some films that are shot, I know on film, and I couldn't tell the difference it was digital or film, So it's interesting what people do. That brings up a good point. What people do digitally to make people think it's film. Like this whole idea of shooting wide open with no depth of field, so everything's mush in the front or the back. They think that gives them the film look. I don't. I think it looks more digital when they do that.
Yeah,
it drives me crazy.
Yeah, me too.
I know, and you and I like depth of focus, right? So, this one director I worked with, I was shooting like 5, 6, 8 outdoors. I didn't care, why not, And he goes, wow, you don't use an ND, you don't shoot at 2.8. No, why? And then, because then when you use a longer lens, like a 40 or a 50 or a 75, when you have that more depth of focus, you're not constantly shifting the focus to keep the two people in. Or something that you do that I always like is you select the focus and say, this is what's important in this scene for that character. And you leave the focus there till you make a judgment to shift the focus rather than trying to capture it back and forth, which I see as a problem for 65 millimeter now. I'm seeing films in 65 millimeter where they're riding the focus all the time because they don't have the depth of field.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how 65 has become so popular, isn't it? Both in film and digital. Yeah.
And this whole thing with VistaVision, I don't get
please.
I don't get that either. Oh, one thing I wanted to ask you, which maybe is part of this or not, because I'm not a big advocate of anamorphic. And I know you don't shoot anamorphic. Could you ever say what your take is? I could tell you on anamorphic, what you like or don't like about it.
Well, I suppose it comes from the early days when, I would test anamorphic for a movie and in the very early days, you had 2 lenses, right? So you had to have 2 focus shifts on the double lens of the anamorphic process. Of course, it's much different now. I just found the complexity of it and I didn't see what you were really gaining. And I've always liked shooting close to characters. I always like to put the camera near to a character. Unless for a specific reason you're not, but I always felt anamorphic was a little distancing. I think it's very different now. The processes, the technology is so much better, but I don't, yeah.
What are your thoughts?
It goes back to the depth of field.
Yeah.
It has a tendency to knock out the background.
Right.
Because it's a longer lens, a 50 has then become something else. I am not crazy about that. I don't want to mention other films, but I will. Baby Girl, right? You see the wide shot you see everything. And then every time they go into the medium shots or the close-ups, the background's totally knocked out. So every scene looks the same. It's like the environment, the architecture is part of the image.
Right. I think that's what I was trying to say in my own way as well. I agree with you entirely. You want the character to feel they're in a space and you want that space to register. And I think, what you're saying, anamorphic, you're often isolating the character in a kind of sea of mist.
Another thing you hate are the flares.
Well, I don't like the flares. I don't like the image shift when you're pulling focus between characters. That bugs me more than most things. But I sound like an old grouch now.
I know.
There's a couple of films that would have shot anamorphic had they happened, but they didn't happen. So there we are.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, when they want to shoot 240, I just shoot it spherical.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Well, it looks great, you know?
So much more beneficial, so much more easy to do as soon as you started having a DI process, because you could go straight off the negative, whereas it was a pain duping it when it was just a film process, wasn't it? You know?
Right.
I mean, today you can shoot you know, Super 35 or whatever, widescreen, a spherical, and the audience sees the best of the negative just as well as would have been originally a show print, which you might have taken 6 or 10 show prints from the original negative that would have been used in like LA or New York, but all the rest of the prints in the old days would have been done from an internegative. So you would have had that kind of slight generational loss. You know, I noticed going back to actually restore really some films that were shot in, you know, Super 35. And being able to go back to the negative digitally, you find actually there was a lot more in it than the audience actually saw at the time.
Right. Well, that's what, you know, like what happened in Carol, and was that you shooting Super 16 and then going right into a DI was like the best of both worlds.
Right.
You still have the film, you know, way exposure worked and the color. And that's something that's, you know, what is for me the difference between digital and film? I would say the way the colors respond. And the way I always say it is, if you have like daylight, you're shooting 3200, you're shooting, and you have daylight coming in the window, and you have warm lights or warmer than 32 Kelvin inside. In film, they mix, like I say, like oil paint, you know, it's like, and so you get yellow, blue, you get green. All right. So somewhere there's a separation that becomes green. Digitally, I find the cool color comes in, the warm color interior, and they separate. They don't connect in a mixture. And so for me, they don't contaminate, I call it. So for me, that's the major difference for me, was to find how to use color in the digital world that I could manipulate. And I found it more complicated than what my eye was trained to do with film.
So how did you get around that?
I have to push the color more digitally than I do in film to get that, you know, but it's not the same. It's really, colors are different digitally than in film. That was something else that you did I've never done, and I wonder if you have a way of doing it digitally, is that you would pull. You pulled your negative in many films that you worked on.
A couple of films, only a couple, yeah.
Oh,
It was a technique. I'd pull the negative a stop and then overexpose 3 stops and end up with a 2-stop overexposed negative. And it would be kind of quite flat and slightly desaturated.
so my question is, are you able to do something like that digitally, or you just do that with the lighting? What, you're not someone that use really filters, do you? You know, contrast filters?
No, I don't think I've used a filter for 30 years probably. No, yeah, I just do it in the lighting. But I've always been somebody that's done it on set with light. I haven't really done that much in either in color timing in a lab or in a DI, really. I mean, how about you? Do you find with having a DI process, do you leave certain things to do in the DI? I mean, there's a lot of people say, well, especially color timers, digital color timers say, well, they find the look in the digital suite, you know.
No, I've never, I go in there with what I think the film should be, you know, and here's the question. Do you use live grain at all? That is something I have used, live grain, you know, which the live grain should be exposed, well, you know, but for your audience, that live grain is a system where they don't just overlay grain from the negative, which I know there's a process at photochem. They call it shift A1, which is it's like using a photochemical intermediate where they take their digital file, transfer it into a film negative, and then retransfer it out. I've never had that kind of budget to do that. It's very expensive.
Is it actually transferring it onto negative emulsion, or is it through a computer process?
I think it's actually into a negative,
right?
Film negative, and then they retransfer it out.
Yeah, I've heard of that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's become quite popular on a few films, I believe.
Well, they did it on the Complete Unknown. But this live grain process, I don't know if you've used it. I have used that, and that I did like that because the difference is it tracks the highlights and the shadow. So the highlights, the grain is obviously smaller and tighter, and then the underexposed or lower light areas of the negative, it's larger. So there's movement in the frame between the frames with where your light is, and it tracks that exposure. So, and it implements the grain size to what your light is. So I find that works. I've used that.
I played with a system that probably was live grain. I've always shot with the Alexa.
Yeah.
And I've always shot quite stand without messing around. And I feel I love the Alexa because it has a little bit of digital noise in it.
Right.
It's not exactly crystal clean. And I haven't shot 65. I think I like the LF, this sort of large format, because I think I largely like it because it seems to mimic what I see through my stills camera, and I love that feeling of depth of field that a stills camera gives.
Right.
It feels more natural to my eye.
Right.
But the idea of manipulating a digital image to make it look like film, I don't really understand that. I don't know why I'd want to do that. A couple of films we did test putting grain on it. I mean, we did test it with Skyfall, didn't we?
This was a while ago, yeah.
Yeah, and we looked at the test and thought, oh, why are we doing that? It doesn't make sense. We really like the digital image. So I've never actually manipulated a final image in that way at all.
Well, no, your films always have a filmic look, whatever you call that.
Yeah, whatever that is. Yeah.
One of the things when the DI process was starting was you had to take the film and you had to scan it in to be able to work with it in the DI. And we certainly found in the beginning the scanners would skew a certain way, and which oftentimes would pick up magenta, which is deadly in someone's skin tone. But we haven't done a lot of film lately. Do you think the scanners are better when you've shot in film and you have to bring it into the DI?
I never thought about that. I mean, the air scanner is very good, and maybe because I'm already manipulating the color so much in the shooting, I don't see. If I was more pure about what I was shooting, I would see it. But sometimes when you're already skewing the image one way,
I see.
You don't really. That's
yeah. It's interesting. If you were shooting Far From Heaven today, which is one of your quite striking, colorful films because it was kind of mimicking
Douglas Sirk.
Douglas Sirk films from that early period. If you were doing that today, what would your approach be? How would it be different?
Well, again, shooting it digitally, right?
If you were, yeah. Would you still shoot that film, though?
Again, I would have to experiment with gels to figure out how that would look similar. He did such interesting things. His cameraman was Russell Meddy. And the whole idea of his films was not to make them naturalistic at all, but to make them an abstraction, because he was in the Brechtian theater where he didn't want the audience to connect to naturalism. They wanted to connect to not to the emotions, but to the idea of what the stories were about, politically and so forth. I played with the color the way they did. They weren't even the lighting, which I did at times, but it bothered me, is that you always felt like studio lighting. It wasn't even lighting from the sources. Like you would see a light on the wall and you'd see the shadow from the light, studio light, rather than the light from the source. I don't know. I would just have to again experiment with the gels with color to try to implement that separation. You know what I realized when I looked at his films over and over again? Even the lights, he used daylight bulbs in his lamps because they went blue, which was very weird. And then there'd be like warm light coming in, but the lights would be blue. Well, I didn't do that. I made the lights. What I did is I call them bug lights, lights that were used outdoors in the patio to keep insects away. A lot of times I would use those bug lights in the lamps and they burn out, and then you get the warmth from the light. But you're looking at it, you don't know that those are yellow bulbs. So I with lighting that way.
Right, interesting. But would you today manipulate the image in the DI suite to get that, or still insist on doing it on set?
I would still do it on set. To me, you can't manipulate everything in post. I saw one shot actually in black and white in Okanda that we didn't have a filter for. I was losing light, and I was using a number 12 yellow filter for the contrast with the sky, and it's a shot of her in a cart going to the guillotine, whatever. And we had the hardest time matching because the more we tried to push it in post, you could see the separation of her against the background, against the sky. And if I had used the number 12 filter that you lose, I don't know, 3/4 a stop, it would marry the background and the foreground. And I could have gotten the contrast that I was looking for. But when we tried to do it in the post, it made me understand again that you can't do everything in post, even when you have all the time and money that you can do on the set. And the other part that you brought up was when you use a filter, which I don't use either, you're affecting the whole frame. And when we're shooting on set and you use smoke or you use lighting, color, or exposure, you're modulating the image in different places in the frame. And so that's why I've always been opposed to doing something overall in the frame.
I think also the other thing too is you want to make the image look the way you want it finally, because if you give it a different way to editorial and they cut it for 6-9 months and live with it looking like that, and then you try and change it in post, they're not going to be happy because they're used to it and they're going to want it the way that they got used to it.
Right. That's so true. And that's why in film, I was like, every night I'd call the lab liaison, and digitally even, because directors get married to what they're seeing in the editing room. And even wrong, now when you're in the post, they said, but it didn't look the same way in the editing room. That's what I like. But it was wrong. No, that's what I like. Because they get married to that. So you have to get your dailies as close as you think they should be, even if you want to change them later. It gives you a fighting chance for finishing the film with what your idea was.
Yeah.
It's true. And it's very funny, too, because you can talk about it on set and say, but this is too blue. This isn't the way that I want it. Oh, that's fine. That's fine. We'll do it later. So they agreed at that time. But if they spend those months with it the other way, the odds are strong that they're not going to want to change it.
If you don't start with something that you're informed about, it's more problematic to convince somebody that it shouldn't have been that way.
It's true. It's true.
All right, I'll bring a question. Does it matter to you if you shoot 6K, 8K, 4K?
I think 4K gives
I wouldn't bother going higher, but it's kind of interesting because when we were shooting Jarhead and Jarhead was going through a DI, in those days everybody was doing a 2K finish.
which was film, by the way. We shot it in film.
Shot on film, but we're doing a 2K scan. And James and I did some tests and we put it to the studio that if you do that, you don't get the grain structure in the film. And it was very important to Sam and us, that the film had a very tight grain. So we did a lot of tests and eventually showed them a 4K scan, and the studio relented and said, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
It really makes sense in certain scenes, certain times when you really need it. But I think Steve Yenlund did a really wonderful presentation about resolution. And it seemed what he was saying is really after 4K, what differences it makes, because your television can show 4K, but it's not showing 8K as far as I know.
I think it depends what you're looking at. I mean, when we did Oh Brother, which was like the first DI of a major movie, the resolution was only 1.8K, so it wasn't even 2K. Nobody said anything about that. And I look at it, it was fine.
Well, I always wonder, it's so interesting, when I did Dark Waters, I actually shot lowest K. I shot 2.8K because I thought maybe I was wrong, but I thought that would give it more of a filmic look to not have so much resolution. But talked yesterday with someone that I greatly respect out of Germany, Marco Messenger, an engineer and a cinematographer. And I said, what do you get out of 8K than you do out of 4K, because you're not going to ever see 8K, right? You don't even necessarily see 4K. You even see a lower. Mainly explain to me, because I'm saying when you're in the 4K world, how does 8K fit in the 4K world? It's still only 4K, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he explained it to me in a way I could understand. He said it picks the best pixels, and the color is better because there are more pixels creating that color that then is reduced into the 4K. And I've never had anybody really explain it to me that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it's the color and the sensitivity and everything. You take that and reduce it later. Then you get the whole argument of you're playing with so much data. And I don't know about now, but sometimes it was so expensive to play with that much and time consuming.
Yeah, very time consuming.
And then how many effects houses are going to work with 8K? I mean, maybe it's different now, but
usually what they would do is just in the workflow, bring the resolution down so you could work with it that whole time, and then bring it back up at the very end.
Yeah, so they do the work at 2K and up-res it afterwards, and you think, well, that's the wrong way around. So yeah, if you do it at 8K, it's great. You've got all that, but also you've got all that information in the image that you can manipulate it more without creating artifacts and stuff. I mean, it's great, but it's I don't know. I've not done films where we, could afford to shoot VistaVision or 8K.
Well, I guess with the Venice 2, that's 8.6K.
They'll make
I
one
know,
with
I know.
20. I don't. I don't. I don't. I think there's so much time is spent on talking about this kind of resolution and technology and how we can manipulate the image, and people forget that somebody like Chris Mengis, who's probably, to my mind, one of the greatest cinematographers ever, he would call his own printer lights. He would get a one light print, and it would be his printer light, his RGB. That would be it. The whole film. He was so specific about what he was shooting and so in control of what he was doing. Of course, on the other side, as you say, Connie Hall sometimes would actually had to change the trim because he would actually, in effect, be printing at a 60, which is, and on one hand, and sometimes he would do a shot where he would time it as a dissolve in the printer, going from like a 18 light to a 50 something light on the same shot. I mean, but we all have different processes. Personally, me, I don't like all this, too much technology. Just want a camera.
Like, I don't even do LUTs. I mean, this scene should look like this. This scene should look like that. I never went in and did a LUT overall, like that's the look of the film.
Right. Keep it simple.
Yeah. It could get very confusing if you had like 20 LUTs you were working with. So which one do we use for this scene? I don't know.
Right. Now, here's something I was exploring, and I wonder what your thinking is. I'm going to do this next film in Taiwan, right? So I'm going to shoot, LF, but there's some scenes I really want to shoot with Super 35 lenses. So I've been told that I could I'll shoot a 240. I can shoot, with the medium format, LF. And then I could shoot part of the film with the Super 35 lenses, and you can put the two together. Have you ever done anything like that?
No, mixing kind of formats and then combining. No, I've never done anything like that.
It still would be 240.
Right.
But I would different, like you say, it wouldn't really make much of a difference with how many K it is, because you would still have, it would be a scene in itself.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about that, to do that.
That'd be really interesting.
Exterior I'll do with the LF, and then exteriors at night, I think I would shoot with the Super 35 because it's in the streets.
Yeah, and it's also extremely different situations, night and outside, and yeah.
Here's a good question. Do you use the same lenses that you would shot in film with digital, or you go to different lenses when you shoot digital? Or different films?
I mean, obviously different lenses when it was with the LF, but otherwise, no, I stuck with the same lenses, basically. Yeah.
You like the primes, right?
Master primes, yeah. I mean, I really don't fuss about lenses. I kind of like a nice clean lens without a lot of flare, the least flare possible, and without a lot of breathing. And, once I found, and they need to be fast and they need to be light because I sometimes shoot handheld, and, as you're getting on, you can't hold heavy cameras so well.
Are the master primes cover LF?
No, for the LF, no, we went
primes.
to the signature primes, which we found great lenses. We tested a whole bunch and then just settled on the signatures. So that would be my choice.
What stop are this?
Like 1.3, aren't they?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And they're true. They're true. That's a true stop, because some lens manufacturers kind of cheat a little, don't they? And you actually find they're not as fast as it says on the packet.
Yeah. Some people like destroyed lenses that have been pulled apart and all of that. Do you like working with that?
Well, I've worked with, I call them ultra Baltars. I made a set of lenses from the original Baltars, and I really did that for the black and white film, that I had played with these, and then this film came up. So I thought, wow, that glass was made. It's a very simple design. It's 6 elements. So I thought, well, that was used in the black and white period. It would be interesting to put that on the monochromatic. But then I used them again on the Maria film. So I like to play with lenses. I used to, in film, would shoot, when I did Mississippi Masala, I used the Cook Speed Pancros for Africa, and then I used the Zeiss Series 2 high-speed lenses for Mississippi, and I had this whole idea that, and also I shot Fuji in Africa, the greens and yellows are different, and then I shot Kodak. So I always tried to play with that as like a different paintbrush. But
Right. But that's interesting, because some people would say now that you change a LUT in the same way as you would change your film stock.
probably.
Yeah, but you don't do that. I mean, I don't do that either, but
Yeah, I don't know. It was like you say, I try to keep it simple.
There's enough
know.
to think about on the set.
Yeah.
I wanted to bring up another aspect of the shift from emulsion to digital, is your relationship with effects work. I mean, I'm presuming there was quite a lot on El Conde as well as on Maria, but it was pretty flawless. Is it changed over the years? I mean, how much are you involved, and how do you keep that consistency of the look of the image?
They just show me stuff, and then I give comments. It's not like, I mean, obviously, I know what scenes they're going to play with, like traffic or buildings, but I don't think I necessarily do anything different to affect that. It's more like I'm aware that this is where it's going to be. I just hope I have a good negative that they can play with it.
Mm-hmm.
And are you always in touch with the process in post?
At that point, yes, they show me tests and I give some comments, because it's true. They don't always know what goes before or after what they're doing, and so you don't want to be far one way or the other way. And that's also true, about exposure. I wanted to say something about digital and exposure. I call it kind of the machismo darkness. Like everybody now can see on a monitor, oh, I have an image, but it's dark. So the whole film's so dark that your eye tires and you're not really fluctuating or modulating the look. Even Gordon Willis said, he was so-called the Prince of Darkness at the time, I always have a midlight and a highlight when I have darkness. If you make everything dark, even though you can read the image, there's no variation.
Right.
Some scenes bright against a dark scene.
All right.
You can't everything dark, because now you have the confidence that you have an image.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I think that's a disadvantage.
Yeah.
Of what
it's one of my pet peeves as well. I think it was Charles Dickens actually said that you can't have dark without light. As you say, it's about the contrast, and you find there's some sort of, it was almost like a macho thing. How dark can we go?
Yeah.
Exactly.
But yeah, I also think that that the fact you don't have to light makes for a lot of sloppiness and a lot of lack of thought about how do I want this image to be lit? Whether you're doing it with natural light or doing it with artificial light, you've got to think about what's the reason for the light? How contrasty do I want it? Where do I want to make the shift between a hot spot and a very, very dark area and manipulate the frame in that way, and the light in regard to the composition as well. Where do I want to silhouette an object? Where do I need to see something and let something drift off? And I feel there's such a kind of lack of control over the image now. Sure, it looks great. You can shoot without any light at all, and you can rate a camera whatever you want, 20,000 or something. But it's somewhere along the line, it's becoming, everything's starting to look very similar. There's no kind of, this is not in your work at all. You look at your work in the last few films and all the films, and you kind of really see a choice of the light and the balance and the color. And
the light also can tell the story.
Yeah.
It can help tell the story.
Right. It's helping to tell the story, whereas a lot of times now it feels just like
you're
recording the story,
That's a very good point. Excellent point.
Oh, we were talking about Douglas Sirk earlier. There's a very defined look to his films, because that's the way he's trying to tell the story. The images, the lighting, the use of the composition and people crossing a frame, and it's all part of a process of the way he wanted to tell a story, which you see with the great directors like Michael Hanke or whoever, but
but it has to come from the director. You can't. How hard it is. You can't make the film without someone that has the understanding that that's part of the language that they can use to tell their story.
Right.
And unfortunately, it seems like they just care about how fast they are to get it done, so they have more time with the actors or whatever. And so you need that relationship with the director that really cares about how they tell their story, like how the language of the story or the images alongside what the story is.
Yeah, I'm modulating it from scene to scene. I mean, so much kind of looks like, but that scene looks the same as the other last scene, camera style, the lighting. Yeah.
I think we've covered a lot.
We have covered a lot, haven't we? I mean, there's
Yeah.
so much we could cover too. I was getting on a bit of a rant there. I better stop, really.
Somebody's got to stop him.
Dear.
If you'd like to sponsor the Team Deakins podcast, let us know at pod@teamdeakins.com. Thanks for listening. If you want more information and further discussion, check out the forums at www.rogerdeakins.com. Becoming a member is free, and you can ask follow-up questions there. And be sure to subscribe to the podcast for more new questions and topics. Also, check us out on Instagram at team.deakins. See you next time.